Oh, we're on. I'm sorry. I was waiting for the sound effects, all the singing and dancing and things like that. Okay. Okay. Let's take a look in more detail about how the Normans infiltrated the area and what were the processes they went through and all of this political manipulation that was going around along with all of these different factions and how they interacted with the Normans and the people in that area. There were Norman explorers to Spain and Italy, and this is kind of interesting. It happens about the same time that the Normans leave Normandy. Bunches of them leave, and they spread out all over the whole Mediterranean. They go virtually everywhere. This is the Normans who go to Italy. There were also Normans going to Spain at the same time, and others who went to Constantinople. Others who went to the Holy Land. I mean, they just went everywhere at this time. Normans began wandering around the Mediterranean before the year 1000, and if you think of Normandy being settled about 911, that was really maybe 2 generations after that the Normans started going around to the whole Mediterranean. When did they first arrive in Italy? Well, virtually everybody disagrees as to when they arrived because all the stories contradict each other. People try to fit the facts together and figure out what happened. Graham Loud argues for the 990s as the earliest appearance in Italy, and he argues that the sources are right, and if they say they arrived then, that's when they arrived. Wolfe accepts 1016 as the time when the Normans first got there. I think Graham Loud is probably right, and what actually Elizabeth Van Hoots does is give you all the different stories and let you make up your own mind so as to when the Normans actually arrived there. But they definitely got there, and I think the before 1000 date is very persuasive. Amatus of Monte Cassino says that 40 Norman pilgrims returning from Jerusalem before 1000 relieved Salerno, which had been under attack by the Muslims, by a group of Saracens. Saracens is another name for the Muslims, by the way. And Prince Gaimar IV of Salerno was so impressed by the Normans coming in and saving the city of Salerno that he sent to Normandy for more knights. And I was very lucky that I found some pictures of these Norman knights. And let me just zoom in on this. Okay, here is a Norman knight. Can you see him up there in the corner? Okay, but there he is fighting, and so that's what these knights would have looked like. Here is another one. This is a Norman archer, and maybe I'll see there. Can you see this archer right here? Probably I should have turned that sideways, but he's firing his arrows. So the Norman army would have consisted of horsemen riding horses and also archers who would have been footmen who would have gone on foot alongside them. Yeah.
How do you know they're Normans?
Oh, how do I know they're Normans? Because these pictures I'm showing you, I have taken from the capitals and the columns of Monreale Cathedral in Sicily, and so this is a portrayal of the soldiers who would have been there at this time. Good question. Okay. The first Normans to arrive, according to Amatus of Monte Cassino, were Gilbert Boiteri and his 4 brothers, Rainulf, Ascleton, Osmond, and Lofold, who responded. Pardon? Oh, thank you. Okay. Okay, the first to respond were Gilbert Boiteri and his 4 brothers, Rainulf, Ascleton, Osmond, and Lofold. They came by land. They didn't come by sea. They marched down across the Alps. They marched through France and across the Alps, through Rome en route to Capua. And there in Capua, they met the Lombard prince Mello, who at that point was besieging Bari. Now you remember that the Lombard prince was Mello, and he was besieging Bari, which was the capital of the Byzantine area. And so there's endemic fighting going on among all these different groups. Mello sought others to join him, and he was welcomed in Campania, and the Normans were welcomed in Campania, and they went with Mello to Apulia, which is where Bari is, so that they could attack the Byzantine Empire. Now, there's a different story altogether by Ralph of Glaber, who was a French historian who was writing in France, somewhat far away from Italy, but he knew what the Normans were doing and what was going on with them. According to Ralph of Glaber's account, a Norman named Rodolph incurred the wrath of Count Richard II of Normandy, and went into exile and took his case before Pope Benedict VIII in Rome. Benedict then enlisted Rodolph and his men to fight the Greeks. This story sounds very suspicious to me. First of all, Ralph of Glaber probably didn't know about it. What have I done? Oh, thank you. Yeah.
And then
all right. Okay, I think the story of Ralph of Glaber is a little bit suspicious. He's not as close to the Normans, and he doesn't know as much as what they're doing. And the whole story of a Norman named Rodolph, who would have run into trouble with Count Richard II of Normandy, or Duke Richard II of Normandy, and then to take his case before Pope Benedict VIII in Rome, is completely anachronistic. This is not something that a Norman would have done in the first place, and it's not something a pope would have taken charge of in the second place. It's not something that would have been done at that time. However, on the other hand, Benedict enlisting the Normans to fight the Greeks is something that we find over and over again in the sources. So even though that story is a little bit suspicious, it still is possible that that Rodolph could have gone to Rome and the Pope could have enlisted him. Now here is another picture of a Norman soldier, and again this comes from the capital at a capital of one of the cloisters of Monreale, and so we can see this Norman soldier about to fight a battle. Okay, let's see if we can focus it a little better. Okay. In 1017, Mello repeatedly engaged the Greek army in Apulia, and he was well beaten by the Greeks. The Greeks were very powerful, and Mello at that point fled to Germany. Well, all the Normans who were in his contingency and in his army split up at this point. They had been serving Mello, but some now went to serve Gaimar IV of Salerno. Others served Pandulf II of Benevento, and others Pandulf IV of Capua. They went to serve the areas that were under the control of these Lombard princes. All of these areas were under control of Lombard princes. Others were hired by Monte Cassino, which was the greatest monastery in that area at that time, and they were more or less hired as mercenaries by all these people, including Abbott Desiderius. The Greeks also used Normans to garrison Troia. So when the Normans first went, they would serve anybody who would hire them. As long as they were paid, they would fight for any of these people, and obviously these groups are fighting against each other. So you've got Normans in most of the armies fighting everybody at this time. There was, however, an effective anti-Byzantine coalition put together by Pope Benedict and the Emperor Henry II. But in 1024, both died, and their efforts to drive the Byzantines out of Italy then fell apart. Okay, and here is another Norman archer. this particular, well, this is a really good one, I think. And this particular one came from Italy rather than Sicily. Monreale, the others I showed you had been in Monreale in a later date in Sicily. This one is from an earlier date, and this is on the Amalfi coast, right by Amalfi. It's in Ravello, that this capital was in a Norman cathedral that was in that city. In the museum there, so it had been in the original cathedral. These are soldiers also on the other sides of the capital. They're marble, by the way, of course. There was an alliance of southern Italian. A question? Zoom out. Thank you. Okay. Other way. There was an alliance of southern Italian powers to undermine Henry II's efforts. And so even though Henry II was trying to drive the Byzantines out, all the other forces in southern Italy got together to thwart Henry II. Why do you think they would do that?
Well, for one thing, personal aggrandizement.
Personal aggrandizement. Any other reasons why they might want to keep Henry II from driving the Greeks out of Italy?
They wanted their independent status.
Absolutely, yes, because if they let Henry II drive the Greeks out, he would come with a German army and he would then put them under his thumb. And so he would proclaim himself emperor. He was constantly claiming southern Italy as part of his own domain. And so this is why they didn't want him. They didn't help him. I mean, they were against the Greeks. They didn't want the Byzantines there, but they didn't want Henry II there either. From 1029 to 1030, the Norman Rainulf invested the town of Aversa. Was invested with the town of Aversa by Sergio IV, Prince of Naples. Rainulf then married Sergio's widowed sisters, and the Duchy of Aversa, or County of Aversa, was the first significant Norman lordship in Italy. So Ranulf was the first to become a Norman lord and to have control, and he became a rallying point for all the other Normans. He set about attracting other Normans to Italy. Then he did something that is actually very Viking, as well as very Norman, which was to switch sides immediately to Sergio's enemy, Pandulf IV. In the meantime, his wife had died, and so Rainulf married Pandulf's niece. So the first thing Rainulf did as the first Norman lord in Italy and Sicily was to take control and build himself some allies, bring some other Normans there, and start building the kind of power that he saw as important to his own aggrandizement, among other things. Okay, and here I have a Norman woman. So let me zoom in on this woman, that you can see her standing right here. Okay. And I'll be showing you more of these capitals when we do art, but right now I'm trying to show you what people look like. Okay. Pandulf then seized Monte Cassino, which, remember, Monte Cassino was the most important of the monasteries in that whole area, and the most powerful, the richest, and the most influential. Pandulf did something that the church grievously objected to, though. He replaced its abbot by deposing the old abbot and putting his own man in there, and then he seized the revenues of Monte Cassino and began collecting all the taxes on Monte Cassino's lands for himself. He then put Normans into this whole process of really suppressing the monastery and devastating it by putting the Normans in charge of its fortresses. And at this time, you are not dealing with castles. In fact, the castles were built by the Normans. As the Normans came into this area, they built castles everywhere they went. The Emperor Conrad, Henry II having died, his son Conrad sent an imperial expedition from 1037 to 1038 because Monte Cassino had appealed to him, and Monte Cassino said, the old abbot who was deposed actually went to the Emperor Conrad and said, look, not only are these Lombards seizing the monastery and despoiling it, but the Normans, these new invaders, are joining in too. And so Conrad himself took an imperial force south to rescue Monte Cassino. He entered Capua and he restored Monte Cassino's property, and once again a new abbot was elected. The old abbots didn't die, though. They just went away and appealed to other people to save them and to help them, and so this perpetuates more and more battles going on in the area. Conrad then invested Gaimar V with Capua. Gaimar V, as you recall, was the Count of Salerno. So he increased the property of Gaimar V, the control, by giving him Capua as well. And Pandolf was deposed from Capua, and he fled to Constantinople. Now, if he fled to Constantinople, you know immediately that he wants to ask the Greeks to come and rescue him, and so he's fomenting a war to go on between the emperor and the Greeks once again. So everybody's shifting sides. Everybody's changing sides. The goal here in this game is to increase your own power and not let anybody else increase their own power. So that's kind of the way they're going about it. Okay, let's orient ourselves to see where these events are taking place. Here is Aversa right here, which is the first, and I'm going to zoom in on that so we can see this area. Okay, is that pretty focused? Okay, this is Aversa right here. Capua is right next to it, sort of down in this area a little bit farther. Salerno is over here. So the power of Salerno is on the rise at this point. Gaimar is operating from this base right here, and he's been able to incorporate Capua and put his own man in Aversa at the same time. And so he's building his power system throughout this area. Okay. All right, Conrad, the Emperor Conrad, also recognized Rainulf as Count of Aversa under the lordship of Gaimar V. And so now we see these Lombard princes falling under the lordship of the Emperor of Germany. And so this is a two-edged sword. You know, Gaimar of Salerno is becoming more powerful, but he still has to answer to the Emperor. Now, at this point, a new group of Normans arrived to destabilize the whole area even further. This group of Normans was led by William and Drogo, who were the first sons of Tancred de Hauteville. And I spelled that wrong. Okay, Tancred de Hauteville was a minor Norman from Normandy, and I'm sorry I don't have my map of Normandy here, but he's from the Cotentin. If you all remember where the Cotentin was, it was at the very west coast of Normandy, the most recently settled area of Normandy, the wildest, most frontier area. It's on the frontier of Brittany. And so it really makes sense that this Hauteville family would come from that area of Normandy. Tancred de Hauteville had a total of something like 14 sons, 2 wives, fortunately. But he had an enormous amount of sons, and all of them left Normandy, and they went to Italy and Sicily. One after another, they would come, and they all joined together and helped each other, and they really became the leaders of one of the largest Norman conquests of the area. They were led first by William and Drogo, who were the oldest sons of Tancred d'Hauteville, and William and Drogo took service under Gaimar the Fifth of Salerno and took part in a campaign to reconquer Sicily in 1038. This was an effort to regain Sicily from the Muslims, from the Saracens, led by the Greeks, and it was actually partially successful because the Greeks occupied Messina and Syracuse, at least for a short period of time. But when the Normans got there, their motives were immediately clear because they complained about the unfair distribution of the booty. In other words, they didn't get enough loot from the sacking of the Saracen cities, and so they broke off from the others and went off adventuring on their own initiative to try to get their own increase in wealth. Their leader was called Harduin, and he apparently was not a Norman. As far as I can figure out, he was not a Norman but a local person who was probably Lombard. Nevertheless, he inspired all the Normans, and he did serve as their leader. He was appointed as governor of Melfi, and Melfi is going to become another one of those Norman centers that will attract all the Normans to come there and rally around it. This group of Normans, led by this non-Norman Harduin, joined with Rainulf of Aversa's Normans, William and Drogo, and they occupied Melfi, Venosa, Lavello, and Ascoli. Okay, this is the region in Campania that I'm going to go back to this other map. This is the region in Campania that is around this area over here. Okay, so they're spreading out more to the eastward and increasing their territory. And here is my favorite of the pictures that we've got so far. This is a pretty neat one. There, yeah. This is the best one I found.
When were these carvings made?
This is Monreale. It is in the reign, I believe, of King William II. It's quite a late Norman church. It's the latest of the Norman cathedrals. So it's moving into the 12th century, well into the 12th century. It wouldn't have been the very earliest of the Norman works.
I have a question.
Yeah, question.
I know this is early for this, but how much under the control of the Norman dukes were the Norman leaders in Italy?
Oh, they weren't under any control of the Norman dukes. They were completely independent. That's a good question, actually.
So that when the Normans take charge of Sicily and such, they have absolutely no allegiance to the Norman dukes.
No, they have no allegiance at all. And this goes back to that question of how united are the Normans and how much of an affinity do they feel for themselves. Yeah, question.
Yeah, this is the time when William the Conqueror has not been able to take control. He's very young, and there is a multiplication of families, it seems like, at this time. So it may be that there's an overflow that's happening here.
You know, that's a very important point that you're making. If you correlate what's happening in Italy to what's happening in Normandy, this is the very time when William the Conqueror is a child, and remember, his father has died, and Normandy just exploded into civil war. And so maybe this is one reason why so many of these Normans are going to Italy and Sicily at this time. Yeah, question.
Well, considering the fact that they have split off, they were able to get their own power by leaving while the Norman dukes were in chaos. Does William, when he does come to power, does he make any attempt to exert influence or power over the Normans in Sicily? Does he try and fail, or does he just not bother?
It's not that he doesn't bother. I don't think it ever entered his mind, which is an important point to make. When you talk about this pan-Normanism and did they all work together and they think of themselves as one people, if they had thought of themselves as one people, why didn't William the Conqueror try to exert any influence over them? And he didn't. Yeah.
And it does seem like there's not as much centralization in these families, Norman families. There's a lot of enterprise in them, and there are several enterprises that are happening.
Yes, that's very true. Did you have a question also?
Yes, when these Normans were going off to Sicily, was that a violation of their feudal vows or obligations to the Dukes of Normandy?
Oh, what an interesting question. A very interesting question. Feudalism was not at that time completely solidified as a system. And so it wasn't the case that everyone in the duchy did homage to the duke. That's not true, but only the holder of the land, so that this is a time when the system of primogeniture is just beginning to happen. Primogeniture means that the oldest son inherits. The oldest son then would do the homage for the territory. The younger sons would not do homage because they wouldn't hold lands. But that the system of primogeniture was not completely in control of Normandy, because you had a kind of mixed inheritance where sometimes only the oldest son would inherit, and other times several sons would split it up. So it wasn't cast in stone yet. Yeah, question.
Well, under, feudalism, did they not owe X amount of fighters to the, did they not owe X amount of fighters to whoever they had their oaths to? And if they did, however, if they did owe the Duke, say, so many fighters, where there was some dispute as to who the Duke would be, where the Duke wasn't in full power, they may have felt that they could ignore these oaths, or, well, there's no set Duke, there's no real powerful Duke in power, they can't enforce it, I'm going to go look for my fortunes elsewhere.
But feudalism isn't exactly like that. I think you're operating under the theory that the Duke of Normandy would control all the land in Normandy and everyone would owe him homage. That isn't how it worked in Normandy at that time. It might have worked that way in England later, but not in Normandy ever. It never worked that way in Normandy. Although the Duke of Normandy would like to claim that he owned all the land and he granted it out to people, that wasn't how it actually worked. He didn't have that much power. And so people owed homage not because he was their lord, but because they held land from him. And it was the land that carried the obligation of supplying soldiers. It's not the relationship between lord and vassal, but rather it's the holder of the land, and the land owed the military service. You see how that works? Yeah.
Then it would be interesting to look at the records from then, should they exist, as to where were these lords that, these Norman, not lords, but these Normans that were coming to other areas like Italy and Spain. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What sections of land did they come from, and should they have been staying in Normandy and fighting? Did they have these responsibilities that they were shirking, or did they not?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and the answer is we don't know the answer, because there are no records as to who held the land. There are some records, but not enough to figure out how many knights were owed for the land and who held it at a particular time. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, it seems like the Normans actually contribute to this organization of feudal concepts within England later on, within William's times and his successors.
Yes, they did.
A certain number of soldiers are owed by even the bishops and all of that.
Yes, the bishops and the abbots owed soldiers for the land they held from the king. And so that's the way the feudal system works. It's not just warriors who owe soldiers. It's also bishops and abbots and religious people who have the land. It's the land that owes the service, the night service. And we do know that it's always the case that in England, more night service was owed for a particular amount of land, and that could be enforced in England because England was conquered, whereas it could not be enforced in Normandy. And you don't see that same amount of night service. I'm trying to remember. There's a book. It's called the Custom Hall of Normandy that is 12th century, that lists all of the night service in Normandy, and that's how we know that Normans owed less night service than Englishmen did, because there is the Black Book of the Exchequer, which I actually brought last week, and I don't think I showed it to you, but I brought it, and that lists night service owed by different holders of land in England. So you can cross-check that, but it's for a later time than this time. Yeah.
I do have a question about, though, the mechanism by which these cities like Capua are being transferred. Is this the entire city that can be transferred to one lord or another?
Clearly not. I mean, the lord will be the lord of the city, but he won't hold all the land. And now this brings up the whole problem of feudalism, which is a very difficult enterprise to define what feudalism is, because feudalism was different in all parts of Europe. And Susan Reynolds has written a big, fat, thick book about that is terribly boring to read, where she goes through and she lists all the lands in every part of all of Europe, Germany, France, Italy, England, and who's holding what where. And what she's trying to prove is there's no such thing as feudalism, because the customs are so different in every area of Europe. And I think she's wrong. There is a basic concept of feudalism, but it's part of its definition is it's wildly individual in local areas. And so that's what I think her work proves, not that there was no such thing as feudalism. Yeah.
But we could add specific questions, like in the case of Capua, for example.
Yes.
If it comes to a particular Norman leader, then what is he able to extract out of that bargain?
Yes, okay. Obviously, when he comes into Capua, he is not going to confiscate all the land. He will let people keep their homes and their businesses and their import-export thing and their farms, because if he takes them all over, he'll have economic chaos and his city will be worth nothing. So he lets everything function the way it is. What he does is, in a limited way, and that comes clear from the sources, in a limited way he grants whatever areas he can, including other cities, to his own Norman allies. But they don't take it over and confiscate it. They collect taxes. And that's how they make their money out of holding the city, is they collect taxes and they can collect military service. And so these two things give them an increase in their power. So that's an interesting question too. So here we have our little knights, which are at Monreale. This is my favorite one. I'll show you that one again, actually. Okay. Now the Greeks tried to put this rebellion down and failed, the rebellion of the Normans under the leadership of Harduin. And whatever happened to Harduin, we don't know. He disappears from the sources, but the Normans took over. And they transferred their allegiance to Atenulf, who was the brother of Pandulf III, Count of Benevento. And Atenulf was then replaced by Argyro, the son of Mello, who, the last time we encountered Mello, he had run away to Constantinople to get the Greeks to help him, but they didn't help him. Mello then returned, or Argyro returned, not Mello. And Argiro then used the Normans of Melfi to wreak havoc throughout Apulia. And what he did was gather these Normans up and inspire them. And this is, again, a Lombard leader who's leading the Normans to ravage the countryside in Apulia. Then Argiro abruptly switched to the Greek side, and the Normans responded by deserting Argiro. As you read through these stories and you think, what is this? It's utter chaos going on. Power grabs, just sheer power and greed among all these people.
The Barons were in their element.
The Barons were in their element, yeah.
But what about the language barrier here with the Lombards communication-wise?
Now that's a very good question. That is a very interesting question. Because I made the point at the beginning of the hour that people spoke different dialects everywhere in different areas. I think the Normans were good linguists. I mean, they had already learned French. French is not that different from Italian, and especially because the French they would have spoken in France is called Old French, and you read Old French, it's much closer to Latin than it is French. Italian is very close to Latin, and at this time it would have been closer to Latin than it is now. And so I think they would have been able to speak to each other. The Greeks are a different matter, but the Greeks in Italy would have been bilingual. They would have spoke both Greek and Latin. Yeah, comment.
However, weren't the Lombards originally German tribesmen?
They were, but they spoke Italian by this time.
They did.
Yeah.
They didn't. I didn't know where they were so close to Germany, if they had kept their Germanic language or not.
They had already, by this time, they had been in Italy for about 600 years, and so I'm sure that...
Well, I meant by proximity close.
Yeah. No, they spoke Italian. I mean, they spoke... The Italian that was spoken at that time was much closer to Latin than it is now, and so it was more like the late Roman dialect of Latin. But remembering that language is completely diverse throughout Italy, and nobody spoke perfect Italian Latin at this time. They all had variations of it.
Well, I've also seen an exceptionally detailed tree of languages at one point my mother had. And it shows all the Romance languages not stemming directly from Latin, but through an intermediary stage called Italic.
Yes.
That it was Latin, then Italic, and then the various Romance languages. So was this true Italian at this point, or was this more close to Italic?
It was more close to Italic, yeah. Okay, so we have the Normans of Melfi wreaking havoc throughout Apulia, then abruptly switching to, Argiro switches to the Greek side, and the Normans responded by deserting. And they elected William their leader, and at this point, this is the William who is William d'Hauteville, of this same Hauteville family. Gaimar V, who you remember was the Count of Salerno, with Rainulf of Aversa, then recognized William d'Hauteville as the Count of Melfi. So we have now a second Norman being in control of an Italian city. We've got Rainulf in charge of Aversa and William d'Hauteville as Count of Melfi. The alliance was cemented by William marrying Gaimar V's niece, and this constantly happens throughout the territory as we see this happening. Okay, and here again I have some pictures of Italian women. All right, if we can see these two lovely figures of women, can zoom in on them. There, okay. So as close as we can get to photographs of Italian women, of Norman women. Okay. William then distributed the Apulian towns among his Normans. Okay. having conquered all of the Apulian towns, he then distributed them among his Normans. And as I said before, what they would have done was tax the towns. That's how they made income from it.
Just a quick question regarding the columns with the pictures. Are there also perhaps, I know in a lot of different time periods throughout Europe you can find woodcuts that show clearly what the people wear, or paintings. Is there a lot of, is there any artwork from this period that perhaps shows how the Normans and the Italians looked?
Absolutely, there is, yeah. And I'll be showing you some of it later on. Okay. All right. Usually, you know, when we see the decorating programs on all of the walls, whether they're painted or mosaics, they will show biblical characters or historical characters dressed in the kinds of clothes that the Normans actually wore at that time. Okay. And so they dress them in contemporary clothes, but they tell the stories of the Old Testament or the New Testament that happened a long time ago. So we can actually check to see what they looked like and what they wore. Well, William distributed the Apulian towns among his Normans, and now there were two Norman principalities, as we said, Aversa and Melfi, both under the lordship of Gaimar V, Count of Salerno. Now, the Normans of Melfi, with the assistance of Salerno and Aversa, set out to extend their power at the expense of the Greeks in Apulia and Calabria. And hopefully I'll have a map, yes, so that we can see that Melfi is over in this area, and so now they're expanding into Apulia and Calabria at the expense of the Greeks. In June 1045, Rainulf of Aversa died, and two of his nephews vied for power. At the same time, Count William of Apulia died, and Gaimar of Salerno made sure that William was succeeded by his brother Drogo, and he gave Drogo his daughter in marriage. So again, you're seeing marriage alliances and family alliances as really important in the transfer of power and the making of alliances between all of these people. And so here we see Salerno again trying to control what is happening. Gaimar finally recognized Rainulf II as Count of Aversa, and we see the succession go fairly smoothly, although most of the successions were disputed. It just inevitably happens. In 1046 to 1047, Rainulf I's nephew Richard arrived in Italy from Normandy, and Robert Guiscard also arrived. And these people are going to be the next key players of the next generation of Normans. Now we have the second generation coming in, and these will be the ones who really build the power and might of the Normans. This Richard became Count of Aversa on the death of Rainulf II's son, and it's not clear that he died a natural death. These young children don't survive very long when there's a powerful man who wants control. Richard became Count of Aversa, as we said. Drogo then sent Robert Guiscard to the fortress of Scribla in Calabria, and Drogo, of course, Robert was the half-brother of Drogo, and Robert Guiscard, do you all remember what Guiscard means? Weasel. The weasel, or the weasel, the cunning, the clever, it has all those meanings. Drogo then sent Robert Guiscard to the fortress of Scribla in Calabria, and Robert led pillaging expeditions to secure booty. What he was just a highway bandit. He set himself up on a high hill, and this area of Italy is just full of towering hills that almost go straight up, and the castles are right on top of the hills. I'll show you a picture next time. I have one of a castle on top of this enormously steep hill that commands the whole area of around. And what they did was just rob people who traveled through the area. Robert moved his raids to San Marco Argentano, and there he was offered the hand of Albarada, the young aunt of Gerard, the Norman lord of Bunalbergo. And so Gerard had been one of those Normans who had been granted lands in Apulia, and he then made this alliance with Robert Guiscard. He must have seen Robert's intelligence and talent, and this was a very fortunate marriage for Robert Guiscard because Albareda's dowry was 200 knights. And so there he was with this army to increase his ambition. Yeah, comment.
Now, it seems like trade was very important to these towns, so robbing would be a good way to get a lot of money.
Robbing would be a way to get a lot of money. I think trade was, because if you go through this area of the country, it's not very productive. I mean, there's very little that you can find there that there's not farmland. I mean, you can't grow anything. The only thing I saw that they might have gained access to some kind of cash crops would have been fruit trees and fruit orchards. And that was the only evidence I saw of real cultivation of land. And it hasn't changed that much over the years. Yeah.
And we do hear about a lot of trade with the Muslims from these towns.
Yes.
So as the trade, I'm wondering if they would actually rob those that were trying to ship these goods or bring them in, or how they would, do we have more detail on?
No. The answer is no. We have no details on what they were trading. And of course, when travelers would go along these roads riding their horses and their donkeys and their pack animals and so on, they'd have to bring a lot of money with them because you couldn't buy anything without money. And so money would be something they could steal from them. Also, horses are worth money. Goods of all kinds are worth money. In all periods of history, I can say in a very general way that textiles and clothing and fabrics of all kinds are one of the major trade items that would be exchanged. Yeah.
I was just curious, but I thought southern Italy was known for its wines. So would there have been a lot of vineyards and wine trading?
Yes, it's packed with vineyards. Everywhere you go, there are local wineries and there are vineyards everywhere. Well, there are grapes and fruits, but there are plums and peaches and oranges and a lot of fruit in this area. But wine is a huge product, and also olive oil. I mean, olive oil is grown. The old olive groves, I saw many very old, ancient olive groves that are still producing. Okay, so Robert now acquired through this marriage an army of 200 knights, and he immediately seized Bisignano, Cosenza, and Martirano. And if we can go to our map, well, let's just look for a moment at another soldier. This is one of those columns. This one is a mounted soldier on a horse. And looking at our map, the area that he is operating in, that Robert Guiscard is conquering at that point, is right in here, and this is where Cosenza is. I'm not sure how far south it is. It's this area that he's operating in, down here. And so this is Calabria, which is the first place that he conquered. In 1049, Bruno, Bishop of Toul, who was a German, became Pope Leo IX. He was appointed by the Emperor Henry III, and I wish we had time to go into this story. It's incredibly interesting because there were 3 popes before Bruno of Toul, and they all died violent deaths very quickly. And so not only was southern Italy going into chaos, but also the papacy was. early on, he paid attention to Benevento. But before I go on with that, let me just recommend this particular book to you. If you're interested in the church at this point, if you're interested more in the story of how the papacy became a reformed papacy and all of the political ins and outs with the empire and the reformed popes and all of their allies, I highly recommend this book, The Church in Western Europe from the 10th to the 12th century, and this is by Gerd Tellenbach. Let me show that. Gerd Tellenbach, who is a German historian, a very, very fine historian. This is an older book, but it's really a superb account of what's happening at this very time in the church. Okay. Pope Leo IX, of course, was the first early Reformed Pope who was leading the charge of the Reformed papacy. Early on, he paid attention to Benevento, and Benevento turned to Rome for the protection of the Normans. Pope Leo IX then visited Melfi and chastised the Normans. Then he charged Drogo and Gaimar V of Salerno with the protection of Benevento. So this is the first time that any of the popes tried to use the Normans as some kind of allies and protectors. But in August 1051, Drogo was assassinated. There's a lot of murder and poisoning and killing going on around here. His brother Humphrey was his heir, and this alliance with his lord Gaimar V of Salerno was solidified when Humphrey married Gaimar's sister in the alliance. Humphrey and Gaimar's brother, then, Guy of Sorrento, allied themselves together and installed Gaimar's son, Gisulf, as the new prince of Salerno. Gaimar, by that time, had died, and so now the family was working together to solidify its power. And the Normans, Humphrey is Norman, but he's working together with these Lombard families. And here again is one of our little Norman knights. If we can see the knight here as he's standing there in battle. Okay. The Normans, okay. Yeah. Leo tried to marshal allies against the Normans, and Frederick, the brother of the Duke of Lorraine, this is Godfrey of Lorraine, became Leo's chancellor. The army was composed largely of Swabians, and also other powers hostile to the Normans. This papal army pushed southward in 1053, and there they encountered the Norman army from all Norman principalities and lordships. And this huge Norman army was commanded jointly by Humphrey of Apulia, Richard of Aversa, and Robert Guiscard of Calabria. And this huge Norman army prevailed over Pope Leo and took Leo prisoner to Benevento under house arrest. Well, Leo then sent an embassy to Constantinople and asked the Greeks to expel the Normans, but the Greeks unfortunately pretty much ignored him and figured they weren't going to help him. Yeah.
Is this the same pope that objected to William's marriage?
Yes. It is. This is the same pope that objected to William's marriage. You know, there would be a lot to be gained by fixing up a timeline. What was happening in Normandy, what was happening in Italy, what was happening in the papacy, all at the same time, so you could correlate all these events. But you're absolutely right. This is the same one pope who went against William's marriage. But he went against William's marriage. Well, it was 1049. It was 1053, so that would have been after he went against William's marriage. Yeah.
Lanfranc had already fixed the northern situation. There was nobody in the south to fix it.
Yeah, Lanfranc had fixed the northern situation, but you know, It wasn't that Leo was so predisposed to all the Normans, but Leo liked Lanfranc. He felt that he was working hand in glove with Lanfranc. There's no figure in southern Italy like Lanfranc that the popes can work with to integrate the Normans. Later there will be. And in fact, just at this very time, a figure does turn up, and his name is Desiderius of Monte Cassino. And Abbott Desiderius turns up at this point, and he's the one who manipulates things and works the Normans around to a point where they can actually cooperate with the papacy. So he fills a similar role to Lanfranc, in fact, yeah.
But would Leo have recognized these two Norman branches as belonging to the same set of families?
I think not. I think not. He saw these Normans as Italians. I mean, they're Norman Italians.
So he had separate problems.
Yes, I think he clearly saw them as separate problems. That's a good question. Okay, so what are we looking for here? Let's see. Okay, the Norman army and the battle that takes place at this point. The battle that takes place is the Battle of Civitate, which I didn't write down. Okay. Where the Pope is taken prisoner. Okay. Yeah, question.
So it seems at this point that though the Normans weren't very unified coming into Italy, it seems by this point that they have unified together as a Norman group.
They have. At this point, they're clearly unified. They're working together. They see themselves as kinsmen. They see themselves as countrymen together, and they're working together very clearly. Okay. Civitate is somewhere over in this area. I'm sorry I didn't write it down. The Normans seem to have won papal recognition of their holdings at this time, and they probably forced Leo to recognize them as under duress. In 1054, Leo was allowed to leave Benevento for Rome, but he died 1 month later. The Normans had accompanied him as far as Capua. Now, once Leo died, the Normans of Melfi took advantage of the victory at Civitate, and at this point they tightened their grip on Apulia. And since there was a dispute in Rome, there was no new pope for 1 whole year, and the Normans could operate in Italy without having any problem with the pope. The next pope was Victor II, and he was the last of the Emperor Henry III's papal nominees. He began on good terms with the Normans. And here we have our cute little Normans again, the really good soldiers. Okay, this was my favorite one. I thought I'd show it to you twice. In 1056, Henry III died unexpectedly, leaving a 5-year-old son, Henry IV, and Queen Agnes as the regent. Pope Victor began to strengthen his ties with Frederick's brother, Godfrey of Lorraine, who then at that point married Beatrice of Bar, the Countess of Tuscany, and both assumed the control of Tuscany. Godfrey was now on a collision course with the Emperor Henry III, and Frederick, his brother, fled the empire and joined Monte Cassino as a monk, and there he was elected as abbot. And this was going to have profound consequences for all these players in this political debate. Victor then died in 1057, and Frederick, the brother of Godfrey, Count of Lorraine, was elected pope as Stephen IX. And Frederick began planning an expedition against the Normans. He looked to both Germany and Byzantium for support, and he sent Abbott Desiderius to Bari and then Constantinople to try to get support against the Normans. I didn't have a picture of Count Godfrey, but here is his daughter, Matilda of Tuscany, and I think I've shown you this before. She then inherited, and she was the staunchest supporter of the Reformed papacy that ever was. We'll come upon her again later. This is Abbott Desiderius, and I'm going to zoom in on it because oh, good. I think we can get that quite nicely. That is Abbott Desiderius before he became Abbot of Monte Cassino. He was Abbot of St. Angelo in Formis, and this is the Church of St. Angelo in Formis. This is a picture of him holding that actual church and dedicating it to God. But there is Abbot Desiderius. Okay. That, by the way, is a painting on the wall of St. Angelo in Formis. Humphrey d'Hauteville died in spring 1057, and Norman Apulia was preoccupied with the succession. Humphrey had designated Robert Guiscard as regent for his sons Abelard and Herman, and Robert Guiscard, being the power-hungry guy that he was, grabbed control of Apulia as the new count, and the two little sons disappeared. We don't know what happened to them, but Robert Guiscard ended up as being count. Now, Pope Stephen IX died, and Abbot Desiderius returned to Monte Cassino. There was a new papal election, and there was a schism. A schism, in this case, is when two different popes are elected at the same time. And there's an argument. The Roman papacy backed Benedict IX. The Roman aristocracy and the Germans backed Benedict IX. The reformers who had taken over when Leo IX came in, that line of reformers backed Nicholas II. And the reformers now did a complete reversal, and they enlisted Norman support. Richard of Aversa had just seized Capua in 1058, and the Normans were becoming far, far more powerful. And Abbot Desiderius seems to have been the one who planned and effected this reversal. Abbot Desiderius recognized the power of the Normans, the importance of their growing power and influence in Italy, and he was the one who made the decision that the alliance had to be made with the Normans. Okay. And here are all the churchmen. This is from that same church. Maybe I can zoom in a little bit so that we can see what the churchmen would have looked like at exactly that time as they were allying themselves and deciding to make a bargain with the devil, you might say, with the Normans. This is a beautiful picture on that wall, isn't it? Okay. Abbot Desiderius, as we said, was the driving force behind this radical change, and the radical reformer Hildebrand, who would later be Pope Gregory VII, we'll run across him again, he went to confer with Richard of Aversa in 1059. Richard sent an army and drove out Benedict X, rescuing the Reformed papacy. Did you have a question?
I'm wondering if the reform agenda itself is why they're aligning all the way with the Normans.
I think they are, because they are in desperate shape. I mean, there they are all alone against the German emperor. Who is going to help them? And what they do by allying with the Normans is they acquire an army, and the Normans save them. That's what happens as we follow the story. In April 1059, the papal election decree is passed, and this is a very important decree among the reformers. They've been reforming for 10 years now, and this decree is absolutely crucial to the success of the reformers. The election of popes is now in the hands of cardinals and not the emperor. The emperor is not the one who can choose the popes anymore, but now we have what is called the College of Cardinals, who come from all over Europe, and they are the electors who choose the pope. Thus the reformers still needed the protection of the Normans because, of course, the German emperors were totally against this turn of events. At the Council of Melfi in August 1059, Pope Nicholas officially invested Richard with Aversa, Robert Guiscard with Apulia and Calabria, and with Sicily, which had not yet been conquered. And what he did was give him carte blanche to conquer Sicily, and he gave all these Normans official recognition as his vassals, who then held all their lands, Aversa, Apulia and Calabria, and Sicily, as vassals of the Pope, and he was their feudal overlord. Here we have our Normans again. I won't zoom in on that. We've seen that one. Our Normans fighting. And in exchange, what the Normans did was they did feudal homage as papal vassals. Guiscard swore fealty to the church and to Nicholas. He swore to keep the papal secrets. He swore to preserve and protect and respect papal territory, to pay the pensiones due to the Pope for lands held from him. In other words, he swore to pay taxes to the Pope. This would give the Pope income, by the way, which was important. He swore to assure that his churches recognized papal jurisdiction, not Greek jurisdiction. And remember, Robert Guiscard was the one who held the Greek areas, and so this was a power play to win back the lands from the Greeks for the church. He also swore, most importantly, to enforce the papal election decree that the cardinals were to elect the Pope. Now Robert styled himself Duke of Apulia, Calabria, and Sicily, even though he hadn't conquered Sicily. And here he is, Robert Guiscard. He now controls Apulia, Calabria, and also actually this area as well. And he claims to control Sicily. Salerno's power, however, and over here in this area where Salerno is, the Count of Salerno's power was now in eclipse, and Richard of Aversa's power was growing stronger. Richard forced Capua to become a tributary, and what in fact happened was Richard of Aversa completely controlled and completely replaced the control of Salerno, and Aversa then became the leading power of the area. Abbott Desiderius now honored the new Prince of Capua, which Richard was, and Richard became the protector of Monte Cassino, and now he was in control of all Campania. At the same time, Robert began to strengthen his control of Apulia and Calabria. But he was kind of in dire straits because that's such a wild country. I wish I could just show you how wild that country is with its huge high mountains and wildernesses and forests. Robert's younger brother, Roger, had just arrived from Normandy in 1057, and the extreme instability of the area allowed Roger to demand power, and so Roger was given half of all Calabria and also rights to Reggio when it fell in 1059. And I'm just going to go back to this map for a minute to point out where some of these places are. Reggio is right there. That's where I showed you that picture where if you look across you can see Sicily. That's exactly where Reggio is right there when it fell, and so Roger is moving southward and in the control of this area. Roger was just as shrewd as his brother Robert Guiscard, by the way. Roger took the last of the Calabrian holdouts, which was Squillace, just before the Council of Melfi. Robert now sought an alliance with Campania with Gisulf II, and when he did this, Robert repudiated his wife Albarada on the grounds of consanguinity, which were probably trumped up. And then he married Gisulf's sister, who was Gaimar's daughter, Sicilgata. She is a marvelous person. She put on armor and fought alongside Robert. They were a wonderful match, a wonderful pair. Robert then set aside lands in Calabria for his ex-wife and his son Bohemond, who was now made illegitimate by this divorce. Actually, the marriage was annulled through consanguinity, and that was what made Bohemond a bastard, and so he was illegitimate. But Richard was the main papal supporter, not Robert Guiscard. Even though Robert made all the vows to the Pope, it was Richard who really supported the Pope because of his power in Capua. Okay, and here we have our map again. Nicholas II died in July 1061, and the cardinals elected Anselm, Bishop of Lucca, as Pope Alexander II. Do you all remember who Pope Alexander II is? Lanfranc's student from Bec, and also the Pope who gave the papal banner to William the Conqueror. Yeah.
It seems like the independence of the popes from the Germans required that there be another power to the south and not the Germans themselves surrounding the popes.
Exactly. The Normans were so handy for all of this. And so I think that Alexander II may have been the first pope to see the Normans in both sides as allies, both in England and in Italy. But yeah, and he's the first one who seems to have seen that. Richard served as a military escort to Pope Alexander, accompanied by Abbott Desiderius. Richard then swore fealty to Alexander II, but then withdrew. But Alexander's position was far from secure. Now the German emperor allied with the Roman aristocrats and appointed another pope, Honorius II, and there were periodic battles and standoffs between the two rival popes. Richard, however, was more interested in securing his own territories. He besieged and took Capua and Soprano and raided up as far north as Rome, and so he was basically securing this area here and then raiding northward into Rome itself. And maybe I'll just zoom in on that. I think we have time. Yeah, and so if we can see the area here where he is controlling right here, and he started raiding up into the Roman area, expanding into that area. Now Pope Alexander appealed to Henry IV, the Emperor Henry IV, to intervene. Alexander encouraged Richard's son-in-law, William of Montreuil, Lord of Aquino, to rebel in 1068, but William died in 1071. Richard secured his son Jordan's accession to Aquino, and Rome and Monte Cassino cooperated. The new Basilica of Monte Cassino was dedicated in October 1071, and Richard of Capua looked on as a distinguished guest. It's really, as I said before, Abbott Desiderius was the key player here in bringing the Normans. He played the role that Lanfranc did in Normandy, bringing the Normans in line with the papacy and getting them and negotiating with them and getting them to agree and cooperate. Yeah.
Did Lanfranc travel back to Rome at some point during these times? He
spent a whole year in Rome. The year 1051 he spent in Rome, and I'm absolutely sure he talked about all these plans. But that was when Leo IX was Pope. Well, Monte Cassino, as a lot of you know who study World War II, was bombed to smithereens in World War II. It was a magnificent church. one of the most beautiful churches in all of Europe. And it's a very sad thing that it was bombed. But we do have the church of St. Angelo in Formis, where Abbott Desiderius was the abbot before he became the right-hand man of the popes. And this is St. Angelo in Formis. That was my little car, by the way, that I drove all over Italy. And it's a small church. It's on the top of a very high hill, and you can see the high hills around it and these typical Italian trees. And it's a gorgeous church, and I'll be showing you more of it later. I didn't have time to print everything out. It's filled with wall paintings, frescoes, and this is the fresco over the door. And what it says here is that Robert Guiscard donated this church. Or maybe, wait, is it Robert Guiscard? It might be Richard of Aversa. I'm sorry. Let's see if I can read that. No, this might be Richard of Aversa. I can't see that this is Robert Guiscard. Anyway, this church, it must be Richard of Aversa. The one I'm thinking of that Robert Guiscard dedicated, I will show you, it's a church in Salerno. Okay, I think this is Richard of Aversa. It has these gorgeous paintings over the door. This is the interior. It's a very typical early Christian church. It has these Roman columns. It has the trestle kind of roof, a wooden roof, and lights across the top. This is a Christ Pantocrator, which is a very common Byzantine image over the church. Here you can see, maybe I'll zoom out a bit to see the entirety of the interior of this church. It is just a magnificent church. You can see that the walls are covered with frescoes. Every inch of them are covered with brilliant frescoes, and I'll show you a little bit of those right now, although we will come back to this church later and see more of it. I'll just zoom in on these frescoes so that you can see how exquisitely beautiful they are, and they're so well preserved. It's just the most magnificent church, probably the best place we went in this whole time. So now we've managed to get the Normans in control of most of southern Italy. When we meet next week, we'll see how the Normans conquer Sicily, and we'll look a little bit at Norman government and how they managed to control the areas they conquered. Okay, see you next week.